Testing. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, can anyone tell me the significance of 11A? Significance of 11A was in the news yesterday. Exactly. So in that horrific plane crash in India yesterday, where we lost 240 people or so, that's right, because people on the ground too, yeah. But the passenger who was sitting, it's actually an exit row on these planes. It's a very, very safe plane. But he was sitting in 11A. And that's why he was able, when the door blew off, he was able to jump out. So that's, if you're going to play the lottery tonight, maybe do some kind of iteration of 11A. On that happy note, I'm going to hand it over to Bill.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, thank you for that happy note. That poor guy, I mean, on the one hand, you think, wasn't he lucky? On the other hand, you think his life will never be the same. Whether he'll be able to enjoy that good fortune is another matter. But thanks for having me, folks. It's great to be here. The town of Wellesley has adopted me over the last few years. I'm not from Wellesley. I'm a Hyde Park kid, a city kid, Boston Latin and Holy Cross and Suffolk Law School. But I've got a lot of friends in Wellesley, and I still fit in my uniform. So that combination, results in me being invited to Veterans Day and Memorial Day parade a couple of weeks ago, and I'm happy to do it. And I'm happy to do it because a society is judged by the things it values and the people it honors. And Wellesley broke the code on that. They discovered and have known for a long time that honoring veterans is important. Because if we don't honor our veterans, then what kind of an example are we setting for the next generation of service members? I was a Marine active in reserve for over 30 years, but I have a daughter who's a Marine now. And she's a better Marine than I ever was. She's was just promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. She's at the Pentagon. She's done 3 Afghanistan tours, an East Africa tour. She's wicked smart. You taxpayers just sent her to Stanford to get her doctorate. She went to Harvard, and most importantly, she's given me 4 gorgeous grandchildren. She just had her 4th child 1 week ago, 10 days ago. And after having 3 little boys, 5.5 and under, she had a little girl who's already bossing the boys around. It's kind of funny to watch, but I can't think of a better role model for a little girl than my daughter, Shauna, because I never even suggested to her to go into the service. But she saw me go off to war and peacekeeping duty, Bosnia, Iraq, and traveled all over the world. And she saw my Marine friends traveled in from all over the country to celebrate the Marine Corps birthday here in Boston, because nobody does it better than Boston. So every November, I have a half a dozen Marine buddies who fly in from all over the world and all over the country to celebrate the Marine Corps birthday, and this is our 250th this year. And she watched that. She took it all in. We used to go to the shelter every Christmas and serve Christmas dinner to the veterans at the New England Center for Homeless Veterans. And, my 4-year-old, 5-year-old daughter would greet them with a big smile and say, "Thank you for your service." And, these gentlemen, many of whom had been living on the streets, who were estranged from their families, who had battled addiction and heartbreak and hardship, would just melt. And when her 3 sisters started coming in, it just compounded the good feeling in there. But she decided on her own, without any suggestion from me, that she wanted to be a part of that. Wellesley understands that, and the way that you honor veterans, including myself, by sponsoring events like this, sponsoring events like the Veterans Day and Memorial Day events, goes a long way to assuring these next generations that military service means something, that it's important, that it's valued by the community. So thank you for that. I wear a bracelet, and I've worn this for decades, of a Marine who died 13 years before I was born. He was a kid from Dorchester. He signed up for the Marine Corps, and he was in the Philippines when the Japanese conquered it. When MacArthur left, the Marines stayed and either died or were taken prisoner, and many of them were sent to brutal prison camps. William Joseph Lynch was one of those young Marines, and he died, and his body has not been recovered. He died in 1944. But I wear this bracelet to commemorate him, and I'm a marathoner. I run through these streets every year for Boston, and I typically do one or two other marathons a year. It's a midlife crisis that went way past midlife. But when we're training for the marathon, we run through the intersection in Dorchester that he grew up at, the intersection of Neponset and Train Street, I believe it is. But whatever it is, it's a hero square now. It's one of those symbols, like the flag, where you've got, in honor of Staff Sergeant William Joseph Lynch, and date of his birth and his death. And every time I'm training with L Street and I run through that intersection, I give a little tap on the signpost and I say, "Semper Fi, brother." Now, the people in my running club think that I've lost my mind, as I'm crossing the intersection to conduct that little ritual that I've been doing ever since I can remember. But to a Marine, and to many of you, that means something. That memory means something. And, I'd like to think that Billy Lynch can hear me, wherever he is now. But whether he can hear me or not, it means something to me. I mean, we Marines have been accused of being a cult, and we kind of embrace that reputation, that we're cohesive, and I don't know if it's so much that as we've made it a code to remember. We remember, and those symbols, like that hero square sign, remind us of the blessings we have because of young men like Billy Lynch and my daughter, who has done 3 Afghanistan tours, an East Africa tour, and it's, once again, most importantly, raising 3 little boys and a little girl. That those things are important. So thank you for that, and that kind of brings me to kind of reach out to those of you which is everybody in this room, that I share a generation with. I'm 67. I'll turn 68 in December on Christmas Day. I ruined my mother's Christmas, and she never let me forget it. It was like getting coal in her stocking, being in the St. Elizabeth's OB ward in Brighton, having little Billy as her second child. But the thing I want to convey to you is our generation has been marked, sometimes victimized, by a number of events, a number of tragedies. And the flag has been a constant in those. Who can ever forget John John Kennedy I think he was 4 at the time, saluting his father's casket as it rolled by in 1963. I mean, just the image conjures up emotion and feeling and consequence when you remember that. President Kennedy was an iconic figure, particularly in the Irish Catholic community that I grew up in, where in my house there was a little shrine to JFK when he was president. A picture of him and Jackie and typically another memento that would mean something, a picture of his cottage in Ireland that his ancestors grew up in. But he said something once that has always stuck with me. And he didn't invent it, but he adopted it. And like so many other things, he embraced it. And what he said was, to those to whom much is given, much is expected. And he was a child of privilege. His family was well off. And for all the money, they've had more than their share of heartache and dysfunction over the years. But he understood that. And I think the flag reminds us of the sacrifices that so many have made, but also kind of calls the rest of us to action as to what we have to give to our country, to our society. I remember 9/11, in that rubble, President Bush standing up there with a megaphone and a flag, just a small flag flying behind him, reminding the world that we hadn't been defeated, that we were going to come back and we were going to fight. That it takes a lot more than this to take us down. And I remember especially, that same kind of emotion comes back to me when I think about presenting the flag of our country to the widows and children of fallen Marines. That's an emotional moment for anyone who sees it. But I can tell you that the first time I ever said, on behalf of the President of the United States and the Commandant of the Marine Corps and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved ones' service to our country and Corps. I mean, as you can tell, it's burned in my consciousness. It means something. That flag is more than just a piece of cloth. It's a symbol of sacrifice. It's a symbol of the desire to give back. A few years ago, right before COVID hit, one of my best friends in Iraq was another Marine colonel. And we got to be good friends. He lived with a couple of obnoxious Yankees fans who were spectacular human beings. One of them became my best friend. And we happened to be over there in 2004 to 2005. And if you recall Red Sox history, that's when we broke the curse. But prior to breaking the curse, we were down 3-0 to the Yankees in the championship series. And his roommate and another close friend of mine, both of whom grew up in the Bronx, were just merciless. They'd see me in the chow hall in Fallujah and they'd say, "Hey, how those Sox doing?" They'd call me up, they'd write me. So, there was this Rhode Island Navy officer, a Navy captain, who retired as a 2-star admiral, and he and I shared an office. We got to be good friends, and he and I would go and we'd set up the TV every early morning because the game time for the games was typically 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning because of the time zone differences. And when they got down 3-0, we looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, this is humiliating." And then they came back and won a game. And we thought, well, at least we've got some self-respect. And I thought, yeah, at least I'm not going to be mercilessly hounded tomorrow by my buddies. And then they won the second game. And then they won the third game. And after the third game, very few people doubted that they'd win because the Yankees just had that beaten dog look about them. Their body language just said, we're defeated. And when I came back for the Game 4 to set up the TV in the palace, I'm going through the gate, and we've got a team of Gurkhas from Nepal that did security at that gate, and I was in charge of the security force. I gave them a namaste, and I cleared my weapon, and they laughed as they always did and said namaste. And right then we start taking rocket fire in the area, and the thought crossed my mind: a rocket's going to hit me. There's going to be nothing left but my boots, and my obituary is going to read, "He never lived to see the Red Sox win at all." So I made it into the palace, and I had watched that glorious game, and the Rhode Island guy and I were hugging, if only out of relief, as much as anything else. And the next day I was in the chow hall, the dining hall at Fallujah, and I spotted one of my pals, and I said, Mac, come over. And there must have been 300 Marines surrounding us. And I said, "Hey, Yankees fan, wait till next year." And I gave him a big hug, and in a stage voice, stage whisper, he said, "I hate you, I hate you." The Boston kids enjoyed it. But his roommate was the son of a heroic Marine officer who served in the Korean War and in the Vietnam War. In fact, he was a regimental commander in the Vietnam War, a real hero. And he had moved from Dallas to Missoula, Montana. Midlife, he loved it up there. He was a hunter. He loved the big blue sky and the beauty up there. And he and his wife had a good life up there. He didn't know an awful lot of other folks because he was kind of even though he died after being there for 20 or 30 years, he hadn't grown up there. But people up there, mind their own business, unless you talk to them, and in which case they're very cordial, they're very embracing. But he passed away, and my friend Sean from Dallas gave me the ultimate honor. He called me up and he said, "Billy," he says, "I know this is asking a lot, but could you come out to Missoula and preside over the burial of my dad?" And of course I said, "Hell yeah." Of course I didn't think about the fact that I was on a plane for 24 hours getting out there, actually 3 different planes, because Missoula, Montana is not the most accessible place in the world, but I was happy to do it. I got out there and I realized we weren't in Boston because they invited me down to the basement for the somber, almost spiritual distribution of Dad's firearms inventory. They're handing out his AR-15s, all of these illegal, these high-end pistols and all of this. And of course, being good hosts, they said, "Bill, would you like to pick one out?" And I said, "I don't think American Airlines would understand, but thanks for the thought." But we had the funeral the next morning, the burial rather, the military honors burial in this spectacular cemetery that was in the hills, not on a mountaintop, but it was pretty far up there. The air was thin. The sky was just pure and lovely. The sun was shining, and I was in my dress blues, as I would dress, my full dress blues, not this this version of it, which is kind of the recruiter's version, and had to be 300 people show up from the town. And many of them were veterans from the VFW and AMVETS and things like that, but a lot of them were just people that had heard that a Marine was being buried. And they didn't know him, but they thought it was important that they come there. And I learned this because, I think I posed for a photograph with just about all of them because, they wanted to commemorate that event. But being able to say a few words in honor of this Marine that I never knew, but I did know because he's like so many Marines that I've met and that I've admired. And I told the crowd that. I said, I never met, John, but I know John, and I know many Johns. And I talked about some of the common characteristics, the selflessness that they have, the sense of sacrifice that they had, especially this individual that could have gotten out after his tour and career, and nobody would have been looking for him to come back to Vietnam, but he stayed on active duty because service meant something to him. But we had the military honors, and we had the firing team there, 21 gun salute as it's often referred to, and then TAPS. And, TAPS is another one of those iconic rituals that affects me and probably affects you when you hear it because, it's more than just a song or a tune. There's momentous. There's something momentous about it. There's consequence to it. And then they took the flag off of the coffin, and the Marine team, who've been trained in this, folded the flag into perfect tricorners. And they took the cartridge shells that had been used in the firing squad, and they tucked those into the flag. And then the staff sergeant who was in charge of the detail approached me, and I stood at the rigid position of attention in my dress blues, and he in his, and we saluted, and he handed me the flag. And I've never experienced such silence in my life. Maybe it was the thin air, maybe it was the mountain location, maybe it was just everybody kind of catches their breath when they see this happen. But I took it, I pivoted around, and I walked over to his widow, and I said what I said to you earlier. On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for the service of your loved one to his country and Corps. And she just started sobbing. And the person next to her started sobbing. And then my buddy, who's a, Marine colonel, started sobbing because, there's a finality to it, but there's something very rich and meaningful to it as well. So I gave her the flag and knelt down and gave her a kiss on the forehead. I don't know if Marine Corps doctrine says you're supposed to do that, but I was happy to do that and happy to oblige. And then the ceremony came to an end, and everyone kind of went back to their lives, and we had a mercy breakfast back at the house, and I posed for several hundred more photographs with the locals, and was happy to do that. And then I got on a plane and flew back 24 hours to Boston. As you can imagine, my buddy from Fallujah was very grateful for that, and brings it up on every occasion. And he says, "Hey, Bill, thanks so much, and you don't know how much it meant to me and my family." I said, I'm the one that should be thanking you, because to me that meant something. To me, that was a privilege for me to be able to do that. That's to me what the flag is all about. That to me is why it's so important that we honor those that have made sacrifices on behalf of those flags. And I'm not just talking about fallen warriors. I mean, it wasn't until I became a Marine dad that, where's Kevin? I was going to say, he told me to talk for 45 minutes. I've already gone for about 50. So I'm expecting a big hook to come out here. But, of course, you ask a lawyer to get up there, and typically they think they're going to be billed for the time, so they're ready to swoop on you. But it wasn't until I got back from Iraq and where you're over there doing what you've trained for. You joined the Marines because you wanted to make a difference. You wanted to be challenged. You wanted the danger. You're too stupid when you join to appreciate just, how bad that can be. But, I was happy to be over there. I was happy to serve. Then I got back and, my little pumpkin had joined the Marine Corps, ROTC, and she, got sent to Afghanistan. And she called me up and said she was out at Camp Pendleton, and she had gotten engaged to her college sweetheart, who was not a Marine, a big football player who is from North Carolina, so he refuses to call me Bill. He calls me Colonel. And I'm okay with that. But Alex and my daughter Shauna had gotten engaged, and she called me up, and she was at a unit out at Camp Pendleton as a lieutenant in Southern California. And I spent some time there before and after Iraq. And I was upstairs, and she says, "Hey, Dad, is Mom there?" And I thought, oh boy, is she pregnant? She says, no, she's downstairs. Oh, good. Listen, I'm going to Iraq. I'm going to Afghanistan, and I'm leaving in 30 days. And I want you to marry us. We'll have the big mass wedding when we get back, but I want to make sure that if I don't come back, that Alex is taken care of, that he gets full military benefits. So of course I said, absolutely, Annie. Then I said, by the way, you're not pregnant, are you? And she said, no, of course not. I'm a good Catholic girl. So I got authority from the governor, and I was able to preside over my daughter's wedding. And it was one of these, Braveheart weddings where there were like 10 of us, 5 from each side of the family, overlooking the football field at Harvard Stadium in the box up there, because they had both gone to Harvard, and he had good memories of it, although not nearly as good as she did. To him it was broken knuckles and concussions from football. To her it was waving pom-poms in the stands and cheering. But we had this lovely wedding that was kind of a secret. Nobody else knew about it. She goes off to Afghanistan, and Alex plans their wedding. He's talking to florists, he's talking to reception halls, photographers, all of those things that typically couples are doing together. And then she came back, and 6 weeks later they got married at St. Paul's in Harvard Square, and a friend of mine who's a Navy chaplain, but a former enlisted Marine, Father Matt Westcott, oversaw the Mass and brought all of his altar service down front to watch the Arch of Swords. And the Arch of Swords is a time-honored tradition for the military. And in the Marine Corps, typically, the last person in line says to the spouse, typically a woman, welcome to the Marine Corps. And then that person whacks her in the butt with their sword. And when my best pal, when I was a young Marine getting married, did it, we hadn't warned my wife about it, my wife-to-be about it. She jumped about 3 feet in the air, and I think she had a welt on her behind for about 3 weeks. But of course, I've got a 285-pound block of granite lineman coming through there who's heard the story. So I hit him. I think I broke my sword when I hit him, or bent it at least. And they went off, and they've, as I say, they've given me 4 grandchildren. But the flag has been a theme throughout my life. And I'm not crazy. I'm not happy when I see someone burning a flag, and I get a little hot under the collar. But hell, that's why we go off and serve, is so that crazy people can do things like that. And I'm happy to be part of that system and that dynamic. And now my daughter's happy to be doing that as well. So I've yapped way too much here, and I really want to thank you for having me here. But can I answer any questions about military service or my experiences or my grandchildren, hopefully, that you might have? Yes, ma'am.
I do not have children, but I wondered because of
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I think it depends on the school and on the district. I hope they do, because I think it's important. I think it's a unifying thing, for our country. But I don't know. Sure. Yeah, there is some history. The Roman Navy had soldiers of the sea, marina, Latin for the ocean or the sea, that would serve on the Roman galleys, the warships. And when the ships, if you've ever seen Ben-Hur, with Charlton Heston, you can recall this. The ships would, after the catapults had attacked each other, the ships would collide, and they'd have ways that they'd attach your ship to their ship, and then these Marines would go running into the other ship and try to kill everything in sight and take over that ship. The United States Marine Corps has the distinction of being founded in a tavern in Philadelphia, which we're kind of proud of. Ton Tavern in Philadelphia. They're actually restoring where they think it was now, because they probably figure that every Marine in the country will feel obliged to stop by and buy some T-shirts or other swag. But it was founded on November 10th, 1775, and being, obsessed with tradition and ritual, that's become the day when Marines celebrate their birthday. And if they don't do it on that day, and usually there's a good reason, like the general that we invited to speak has an engagement at headquarters Marine Corps on the 10th, which is typically the case. I celebrate with the Semper Fidelis Society, which has a luncheon at the convention center in Boston, and there's 2,000 Marines there from every era. I mean, it's just, I tell people it's the biggest psychotherapy session in the world, because you've got Marines that never talk about their experiences, especially the war veterans, except when they're in that room or in the obligatory after parties, where after a jar or two, they're talking to each other because they know that they're talking to people who understand. But it's a great event, and my buddies will come in, as I mentioned to you about the impression it made on my daughter. My buddies will fly in from all over the country, and they'll stay for the luncheon and the parties afterwards. Sometimes they'll come for a whole weekend or for several days. When my late mother after my dad had passed away, my late mother would love it when they'd come to visit because they'd all stay at her house. And of course, they'd flirt with her, and the obnoxious Yankees fans would bring Yankees caps up for her, knowing that it galled me for them to do that. In fact, when my mom passed, and she lived to be 80 years old, which is pretty good for a 4-pack-a-day smoker, registered nurse, but a 4-pack-a-day smoker. I called up Mac, one of the Bronx twins, and who would stop at Babe Ruth's grave every time he would drive to Boston for the Marine Corps luncheon. That's how serious a Yankees fan he was. But I called him up and I said, "Hey, Mac, I've got bad news. Nana passed away." And he says, "Oh, that's terrible." I said, "I just want you to know we buried the Yankees cap you gave her with her." And he says, "Oh, that's so nice." I said, "Yeah, just to make sure we got rid of that thing." And much like in Fallujah in the dining hall, he said, "I hate you." But yes, ma'am. Yeah, I don't think that's an appropriate or necessary use for for a unit of the finest fighting force in the entire universe, who needs to be ready to deploy if Iran decides that instead of attacking in response to the Israeli bombings, is going to take out a U.S. base in Guam, or is going to start firing rockets into someplace else. Without getting into any of the politics of it, I just don't think it was an appropriate use for those troops. And I know that from some of my personal connections that they're not relishing in it either. They're going to do what they're told to do. That's what Marines do. But I can't imagine a Marine who signed up like I did to defend his country, being happy about being stuck in some federal building in L.A. But legally there's some issues because of, the federal law posse comitatus prohibits the use of military forces for civilian activities. Now, the administration has characterized this as being, an insurrection or an invasion. You be the judge as to whether you think that makes sense. But I just, from a practicality perspective, I don't, I just don't see it. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
On the flag itself, why is there, sometimes there's the gold tassel, but there are some flags that don't have it. What is the meaning?
I'm not sure. I can tell you that the Marine Corps has flags that the American flag that they call battle standards. And they will have, in addition to this, they will have streamers commemorating every major engagement the Marine Corps has been in. And as you can imagine, it's kind of a hallowed item. It's something that's considered to be almost sacred. And Marines will die in order to, much like the Legionnaires, I think somebody had mentioned, you had mentioned, would, do anything and die in order to preserve their standard. Marines feel that way about the flag, and especially the flags that have the battle standards on them, commemorating those battles. Questions? Yes, sir.
So, are flags taken into battle or not?
We don't take them now just because from a tactical perspective it would be, too risky. But for millennia, battles were what motivated the troops, what led the troops, whether it was the legions or the Spartans and the Athenians, or Napoleon, or the British forces, the the Scots, with their bagpipes and standards and drums and all of that. I think in the First World War, they did that, and then they started to realize that, there's snipers out there that can hit a human being from 600 or 700 yards away. Why make it an easy target for them to do that? But, I'm sure North Korea or someplace like that probably still, does that or does something like that, but we don't do that. Questions?
Medals given off for capturing the flag.
Yeah. That was the old days, and typically it took a lot of courage to put yourself into harm's way in order to do that. I mean, as I said, this is why we draft, or we used to draft, 17-year-olds, because if you've lived a while, you realize, gee, maybe that's not the smartest thing in the world, and has anybody here been to Normandy? Battlefields? Yeah, I mean, just incredible. And of course, if you go to Normandy, you go to the cemeteries at some point. And my youngest daughter, I've got 4 daughters. I'm one of 4 boys, so this is God's revenge, right? And now I've got 5 grandsons and two granddaughters. But my baby, who's 32 now, she's a psychologist who treats post-traumatic stress, which is what happens when your father and sister are Marines. She and I travel around the world running marathons and gives us an excuse to travel. My wife hates to fly, but is very supportive of us traveling. And she came to me when she graduated from college and said, "Hey, Dad, I start graduate school next year. I'm going to be poor and busy for the next few years. I'm going to backpack through Europe." And of course, being the protective father, I said, "Well, who's going with you?" "Nobody." I said, "What?" She says, I said, "I don't think that's a good idea." And of course, as my daughters are prone to do, they said, "Look, I didn't ask for your permission, Dad. I'm a grown woman, right?" And I said, "Okay." I said, "But, you got to be careful." She says, "Dad, I understand, and she is. She's very, very thoughtful, very careful. But then she says, "Why don't you start me off by running a marathon with me in Europe someplace?" And then, I'll be gone for 6 weeks backpacking. And so I looked at some marathons and we found one in Waterford, Ireland. It's the Waterford Viking Marathon. Only we Irish commemorate being invaded by Vikings, with a celebratory marathon. But we ran the marathon. We went up to Dublin, did the Guinness brewery tour. I went to the Viking Museum, went to the Riverdance show, and then we flew to Paris. And we got in my rental car. We went up to the battlefields, and just we got a good tour guide, a former UK Army military man. So he was able to kind of describe for us and the rest of our group, what the tactics were, what the strategy was, point to hawk, the airdrops, the cliffs, so many of those things that you see in Private Ryan and these other shows, but it doesn't really sink in until you're actually there. And you look up those cliffs and you say, "Oh my God, who the hell would go up there with people shooting at them?" But these kids did it, and they took that hill, and they won that battle. Just amazing courage that, I felt like, I got so much out of that trip. And then, of course, followed by these endless rows of crosses and Stars of David, of these fallen warriors. If you don't have a lump in your throat or a tear in your eye after looking down those rows, you're not paying attention. You just don't get it. It's really an incredible thing. All right, other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there a limit, like underpants, what is considered rude? What point is it rude?
That's a great question. For our generation, that was a big deal, that, you had to burn the flag in order to dispose of it properly. And that's still the tradition. But society changed. In the 60s, you had, people wearing flags, as a sign of protest or as a sign of fashion. There's no law against it, my perspective is, if it's respectful, fine. If it's disrespectful, it's not fine. But, I'm not going to beat you up or anything like that. That's it's not worth my time. But it's one of those changing times things that I bet if you contacted the VFW or the MVets, they'd have a set of rules. In fact, I've seen them, at least in the past, of proper display of the flag. But I bet there's post commanders now that couldn't tell you the first rule because things have changed. Plus, they're struggling to stay in existence. Because these posts that were so busy for so many years. People have aged out or passed away, and a lot of the young generation have their own ways of veterans have their own ways of communicating and they act. It used to be that your treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder was long neck Budweisers in the post, right? And then, you'd have too many and you'd have a fight with your buddy and the two of you would get it out of your system and everything would be great. And everybody say, yeah, that's just the boys being boys. Nowadays we realize that that's a symptom of, a very significant mental illness. Running with my psychologist's daughter on these long runs, training for the marathon, I finally realized a couple of years ago that she was psychoanalyzing me the whole way. And I have some post-traumatic stress, and I think a lot of people do. You see beautiful young men and women die, and it's tough not to take that stress on. I used to visit the hospital in Baghdad a couple times a week, and I'd go to the ICU and visit our wounded there. And these medical professionals did heroic things. I tell you, I just developed such respect for these Army and Navy and Air Force nurses. The Marine Corps doesn't have nurses. We have, the Navy medical personnel, doctors and nurses treat us. And they were just spectacular. I remember walking into the ICU and there was this patient that had just come out of the ER and he was sedated. He had railroad tracks across his head. And I said to the nurse, this young Army major, I said, oh my God, it looks awful. And she looked at me, she said, Colonel, I don't mean to jinx him, but I think he's going to be okay. They had him on a helicopter 10 minutes after he was wounded. They had him here 10 minutes later. We had a surgeon waiting for him who was able to go in there and take out the shrapnel before there was any swelling. That golden hour they talked about during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, it's now the golden 25 minutes because they've gotten so sophisticated at the transportation side of it and the communication side that they can have somebody waiting ready to treat that patient. And I'll give you one more hospital story that is one of my favorite. I was in there one day, and it was the shortly before the first free elections in Iraq, and I went up to the ICU and I saw that there was a huddle of medical people around a gurney. And I could tell it was a Marine because we're the only ones that wear the green T-shirts. The Army wears brown ones, the Navy wears, blue ones, the Air Force wears, lavender ones. And I'm standing back at a respectful distance, and that same nurse, that major, calls me over and says, "No, sir, come on over. It's one of your guys." I said, "Yeah, I can see that, but I don't want to get in the way." And she says, "No, he's just about to get on a helicopter to go to Balad, which is a base in northern Iraq that has the next echelon of medicine. They would treat him there, and then they would send him on to Germany, to Ramstein, or one of those places that had real hospitals. So I'm looking at him, and his neck is the size of a football. He's got a trach in him. And I said, "Oh my God!" I said, "Major, he looks bad." She says, "Sir, I hate to say this to you again, but I think he's going to be okay." I said, "What happened?" She said, "He got hit by a sniper round in Ramadi. He was on patrol, and it missed his windpipe. It missed his arteries. It was through and through. It caused swelling, but the trach took care of that. He was conscious. He was alert. He's listening to me. His eyes are following me as I'm talking to the nurse." And she said, "And he can communicate." I said, "How the hell can he communicate? He can't talk." She says, "Well, when he wants to talk, he'll stick his hand up through the blankets that we've wrapped him in, and he'll go like this. It's like the Addams Family, the thing, with the hand up there. And I'll slap a pad of paper down on his chest, and I'll hand him my government pen, and he'll write out whatever he needs to tell us." So I said, "Well, that's incredible." So we can hear the helicopter coming in. So I'm following him onto the elevator because we go down a flight, and I remember his name was Lance Corporal Chacon. And I said, "Hey, devil dog," it's one of those term of endearments that we Marines use for each other. "We're proud of you. You're going to go home. You're going to get great treatment. I'm happy to call your mom or your girlfriend." He looked too young to have a wife. I said, "What can I do for you?" And his hand comes up through the blanket just as the helicopter's starting to land. And I slap out my government black pen to him, and he takes it, and he writes on a pad that the major has put down on him, and I can't see what he's writing, but she picks it up and she just starts laughing. And what he's written is, "Yes, sir, get that son of a bitch sniper in Ramadi Center." And I thought to myself, where do we find people like this? Where do we find young men and women that are willing to have that outlook, that approach, that sense of purpose? So I just started laughing, and I said, "You've made my day, Marine." And they put him on the plane, and they took him away. And about a month later, I saw a Marine captain, and we're talking in the chow hall or someplace, and I said, "What unit are you with?" And I think he said, 2-8, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. And I paused and I said, "Did you ever serve with a young Lance Corporal named Chacon?" And he said, "Yes, sir. He's back in the States now. He got wounded." And I told him the story. And this young captain, just big smile on his face, and he looked at me. He said, "Sir, we got your note," because I had sent it back with somebody from the unit. And of course, it was one of these things where he was going to give it to somebody else, was going to give it to somebody else. So I said, "Well, they're never going to get it," but He says, No, we got it, sir. And when the guys in our unit saw that, you did not want to be a terrorist in Ramadi Center. He said our warriors were motivated for Chacon, and just one of those things that just sticks in my consciousness and makes me proud of these young Marines, like my daughter, who's as tough as any of them. Yes, ma'am.
So, yes, your daughter is in the Marines.
It's 12 to 15%. So they were a distinct minority. When she went in, I said, "Honey, you're going to a man's world. You're going to have some uncomfortable experiences with people that are going to say stupid things, and you may not even realize that they're saying stupid things." And she said, "No, I get it, Dad." I said, "You got to pick your fights carefully, but if somebody belittles you or ignores you or doesn't follow your orders, you got to deal with it." And she's hard as nails. She's also a great mother and loving wife, and just a great person. But, she has fired Marines that, weren't doing their job, or that, would say, oh, lieutenant or captain or major, you women just don't understand this thing, or, you just don't understand what it's like for our warriors out there. And they weren't doing their job, which is why they resorted to, to playing the gender card. She's got, and I've met so many of her troops who just worship her because, she's got their back. One of these troops had come up to her afterwards. In fact, it was the sergeant major of the battalion who came up and said, hey, ma'am, thank you for getting rid of gunnery sergeant so-and-so. And she did it the right way. He was going to get us killed. The good portion of the unit was about like her to go to Afghanistan. He retired on the job years ago, so thank you. But it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. My other 3 daughters, it's not for them. Yeah. 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 The biggest problem is, under pressure, you run into some dinosaurs, and alcohol is an issue. You've got these, particularly for the young enlisted, you've got these, 18, 19-year-old young men and women that have never been away from home before. They get blackout drunk, and they wake up next to somebody that they have no idea who it is. So she keeps an eye out for her, young male and female Marines, and make sure they understand that's not an excuse. But it's a cultural education that a lot of these young Marines have to get. Yes. It's, and I'm not saying this because I'm a Marine. It's tougher. It's more rigorous. It's more physical. And more demanding. The Marine Corps learned a long time ago, you don't make good Marines by belittling them or humiliating them or having them come down with heat stroke. In fact, Marines, sergeant instructors and DIs go to jail for that now. You make them, as a general told me once, he said, you make them better Marines by putting in front of them role models. You put in front of them people that they look at and they say, oh my God, I want to be like that guy. Oh my God, I want to be like her. That's how you make better Marines. So we've come a long way. We're not perfect. We have, issues from time to time. But, training, Marine Corps puts its best people into recruit training and officer training. It's not the has-beens. It's not the folks that couldn't hold another job. Not that other services might do that, maybe. We take it very seriously, and I'd like to think it shows, but you be the judge. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is the ideal deployment for Marines the first?
MSG Marines, Marine Security Guard Battalion Marines, typically are selected. It's a very rigorous process of people that have had no disciplinary issues, that are high-achieving Marines based on testing and promotions, and that are 6'1" Hollywood good looks. Not so much now, but it used to be that they would stand out in a crowd, and of course it also made them attractive to some of the local men and women, these good-looking male and female Marines that would be in their dress blues. But those are high-pressure jobs, particularly in this era of terrorism, where so many embassies are soft targets for terrorists. So they take their jobs very seriously, including in Paris. Yeah. All right, folks. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.